journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Just over a year ago, Myanmar security forces were wrapping up a massive offensive against the country's Rohingya Muslim minority. Now, for the military, this operation was an enormous success. In a matter of weeks, more than 720,000 Rohingya were forced to flee to neighboring Bangladesh in what the head of Myanmar's military called, quote, a clearance operation in the country's Rakhine state. A year later, we have a clearer picture of what happened in Myanmar last year. A recent report from the UN Human Rights Council concluded that at least 10,000 people were killed, nearly all civilians. Myanmar security forces gang-raped Rohingya women and burned people inside their homes. Children, the elderly, and people with disabilities were not spared. Now, the UN report recommended that several of Myanmar's top military officers be investigated and prosecuted for genocide and crimes against humanity by an international tribunal. It was also critical of the role of Myanmar's civilian authorities, including state councillor and former Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. So on this edition of Global Journalist, we'll take a closer look at the campaign of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar and the future prospects for both the people who carried it out, as well as the nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees across the border in Bangladesh. In a few minutes, we'll hear from three people who have been following this issue closely. To kick things off, we're going to bring in Ro Nay San Lwin in Frankfurt, Germany. He's a well-known Rohingya blogger and is a spokesman for the Free Rohingya Coalition. Nay, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Well, the Rohingya have experienced decades of discrimination in Myanmar. Obviously, this isn't something that just came about last year. You left Myanmar back in 2001. What was your experience with discrimination?
I was born in northern Rakhine State in Buthidaung Township, but I left from Buthidaung in 1984 when I was at 6 years old because my parents were the civil servants and they got the job transfer to former capital Rangoon, so I was raised in Rangoon. But, you know, while I was living in Rangoon, I didn't hear much about the persecution against the Rohingya because there was the telecommunication problem and the many restrictions in Rakhine State, so nobody is brave enough to inform the people who are living in capital or across the country. So when I left from the country in 1997, I started hearing about the plight of my fellow Rohingya in Rakhine State because since there are the several restrictions against the Rohingya, they cannot move to they cannot travel to the state capital city. Whenever they need the emergency medical treatment, they need to go to the Bangladesh, and from there, you know, they spread the information wherever they have, how they are suffering, how there are the restrictions imposed against them, how they are living in the situation like living inside the open air prison. So I start hearing about their suffering in 1997. At the time, my father also left from his government job and he was working abroad. He told me his personal experience before I born in 1978. You know, he witnessed the Dragon King operation. He told me that this is what we are facing is the genocide. So I heard the word genocide 20 years ago.
So it sounds like your family actually, because you grew up in the capital, didn't experience many of the restrictions that the Rohingya have traditionally faced. Restrictions on freedom of movement, restrictions on family size, how many children you could have, the use of forced labor, evictions. But then you moved overseas and you lived in Saudi Arabia for a time. But even then you had some problems with the government.
Yeah, because, you know, after I left from the country in 2001, this was my last time in Myanmar. So I decided to work for the Rohingya. I started the campaign for them in 2001. In 2008 or 9, I don't remember, when I tried to renew my passport at the Riyadh, at the embassy in Riyadh, they stopped renewing my passport. They told me that they need a special permission from the NAPIRO because they know that I am campaigning for my people. That is the reason, they stopped renewing my passport, and finally I had to migrate to Germany to sought the asylum here. But
so essentially you became a stateless person, and this is one of the issues the Rohingya have faced historically, is that they don't have citizenship within Myanmar and aren't granted the same rights as other citizens. But let me ask you about Aung San Suu Kyi specifically, because you grew up in Myanmar during the time of the military dictatorship. She was obviously an icon of resistance to that dictatorship and a well-known democracy proponent. How did your views of her change?
Since I was child, I was at the 10 years old. I follow her. I joined the first public appearance at the Srinagong Pagoda, and we were always following her. I was her big fan. We like her speech. We thought that the country will change when she got the power, and the Rohingya also supported her. My own uncle lived in Budidong. He was the founder of her party branch in Budidong Township. We have supported her, and also the 4 Rohingya represented her party in 1990 election. But unfortunately, now she's pretending like as if she has never met a single Rohingya in the country. When she formed the committee for representing the people parliament, and she used to have the one Rohingya parliament member. So now, all her party member and also the senior official who have the relationship with the Rohingya, they are also denying our existence. They are just backing the propaganda made by the Burmese military. So they are saying saying as if we are the recent migrant. We were just given the white card by the temporary registration card by the military government. But actually,
so sorry. If I could just recap your point, then it sounds like Aung San Suu Kyi, she had a lot of support even while she was a political prisoner during the military junta. She turned her back, or you feel like she turned her back on the Rohingya since being released, and since since her party, the National League for Democracy, took power back in a couple years ago. But let me turn you, if I could, to the roughly 1 million Rohingya who are living in refugee camps in Bangladesh now. How likely is it that these people will be able to return to Myanmar?
This is not the first exodus. This exodus started in 1978, again in 1991, again in 2016, and then 2017. This is the 4th exodus. In 1978, about 270,000 had to flee to Bangladesh, and they were repatriated a few months later as Rohingya. But in 1982, their citizenship were taken away, and we became stateless within our own country. So, now they again launched the operation against these people because they didn't have the protection. So now almost 1.1 billion people are taking refuge in Bangladesh. These people cannot go back to their homeland unless there is the international protection for them. For sure, Burmese military and the Burmese government will never give them the protection. If they go back, they will be persecuted again, and they will have to flee to Bangladesh again. That is the reason even the Bangladesh Prime Minister is asking the safe zone, but we are not asking the safe zone. We are asking the international protection, different protection, not like the UN peacekeeping force. So these people.
Well, we're going to talk about the prospects for some sort of peacekeeping force a little bit later in the program. But we're just out of time for now, Nay San Lwin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
A reminder that this is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about the prospects for justice for those in the Myanmar military who carried out what a UN investigation team concluded was genocide against the country's Rohingya minority. We're also going to be looking at the prospects for the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya who have fled the country and are considered stateless people. Now, to broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in three other guests. Joining us from Binghamton, New York, is Maxim Pensky. He's the co-director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. Max, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And with us from Bangkok, Thailand, is Verena Hölzl. She's a journalist based in Myanmar who's reported for Time, Deutsche Welle, and the German magazine Der Spiegel. Verena, welcome.
Hi.
And also with us from Chicago is Azeem Ibrahim. He's an adjunct research professor at the U.S. Army War College and author of the book The Rohingyas, Inside Myanmar's Genocide. Azeem, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Max Pensky, if I could start with you. Let's start with the word genocide. That's one thing that was striking about this UN Human Rights Council report that was released several weeks ago. Were people expecting this? What's the significance of the use of that?
Well, diplomatic language in general and UN language in particular has been traditionally very reluctant to use the word genocide to describe these massive violations of human rights. And the reason for that is that the Genocide Convention, which is 70 years old this year, from 1948, has signatories from all over the world, including Myanmar. Signatories to the Genocide Convention commit, as a matter of law, that they will do whatever is in their power to prohibit, prevent, and punish the crime of genocide. So for that reason, when a diplomatic body like the UN goes on record in an official document and labels a mass atrocity as genocidal, that also signals to the international community that they have themselves very concrete legal obligations that they have to fulfill in order to fulfill their commitment to the as signatories of the Genocide Convention. So it's not.
We'll talk about whether or not those obligations actually are getting fulfilled or will get fulfilled in a moment, but I want to turn this to Verena Hölzl as well, because the other thing that was striking about this UN report was that it actually names several names of generals in the Myanmar military and says that these are the people who ordered this, who planned this, who carried this out. The Army's commander-in-chief, a guy named Min Aung Hlaing, the deputy commander-in-chief of the Army, Aung Kyaw Zhao. How is this received within Myanmar? What do you think the significance of this is?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that the reaction wasn't as strong as I think people outside of Myanmar would have expected. So the publication of the first summary coincided with the banning of the commander-in-chief Min Aung Hlaing from Facebook, and that actually caused a lot more outrage among the people in Myanmar than this report unfortunately did.
So banning the Army commander-in-chief from Facebook caused more outrage than this UN report accusing him of genocide, essentially.
Yeah. So you have to see that people don't believe in these allegations at all. So like all these reports that have been out there for like over a year now, they are considered fake news. So the UN report didn't make any exception, unfortunately.
Well, let me turn this to Azeem Ibrahim. My understanding is that sort of a key component in showing that something is genocide is that you have to show that there was planning and organization of attacks on an entire population in advance. Obviously, the Rohingya have been treated badly in Myanmar for a number of years. Is there demonstrable evidence that what took place last year was organized and planned in advance?
If one looks into the report that the United Nations produced, all 444 pages of it, it becomes extremely clear that there was extensive planning, pre-planning and organisation behind this campaign to rid the country of the Rohingya. The Myanmar military and Myanmar authorities have been working on this for over half a century, and now that they've seen an opportunity to do so, they essentially executed it with military precision. And this became very clear, this comes out very clear in the United Nations report, that multiple villages were attacked At the same time, the exact same tactics were used in each of the villages where people were isolated, women and children were separated from the men. They set up various rape camps in the villages, houses were burnt down. So this comes out very clearly that this was pre-planned, and this is why the United Nations made the determination that this is a genocide.
Well, Max Pensky, so, the UN, it's named names. It released this huge report based on 800 and some interviews with Rohingya, with victims. What's the next step for seeking justice at the international level for those responsible for what took place last year?
Well, the next step is really shifting from the United Nations to the International Criminal Court. And they have made a very bold move in the last few weeks of claiming that they have jurisdiction to prosecute the top military leadership of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military. And the reasoning for that is not on the basis of genocide. They're not taking that route as yet. They are saying that forced deportation, which is a crime against humanity, entailed moving 750,000 of Rohingya refugees across the international border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. So that while Bangladesh is a member of the International Criminal Court, that gives the court an opening to assert jurisdiction and begin a preliminary investigation that may lead to indictments. So
sorry, just to clarify then, I mean, this sounds a little bit like prosecuting Al Capone for tax fraud or mail fraud, if you will. Why isn't the ICC opening an investigation into genocide or into the other atrocities? Why forced deportation?
Well, it is true that forced deportation as a crime against humanity is not quite equivalent to the crime of all international crimes, genocide. But as you point out, from the point of view of the prosecutor, the job number one is to find a way to assert jurisdiction over these people to prosecute them. That gives them an opening to do things like secure evidence and to get investigative teams, if not on the ground in Myanmar, which is not very likely, at least in Bangladesh. And we don't know what charges could be made possible later on. This was done because it was the only way that the Office of the Prosecutor of the Court could think of to find a way to claim jurisdiction on these crimes.
Okay, because for the ICC to bring a case based on crimes that took place inside Myanmar, either Myanmar itself would have to make a referral to the International Criminal Court or the UN Security Council would have to refer the case to the International Criminal Court.
And the latter possibility was extremely unlikely given the high likelihood that China, which is a permanent member of the Security Council, would have vetoed that attempt.
Well, Verena Hölzl, I want to ask you about the case of these two Reuters journalists who have been in jail since last year for reporting on a massacre of Rohingya men in one village that took place during the events of last year. Their names are Walone and Kyaso. Remind us what it is they did and what their status is.
Their status is that they were, beginning of September, they were sentenced to 7 years in prison, both of them, for breaching the national, for like telling the international community national secrets, basically. So, if you will, they are accused of being spies and work for the international community. What they actually did is they are Reuters reporters, and they were brave enough to go into northern Rakhine state, which was and still is a black box for most journalists because foreigners aren't allowed in. And locals are very much scared of going in because they know these things can happen. And the one big thing that they managed to get is like the admission of perpetrators that these crimes really have happened, and that obviously didn't go well with the government and the military.
Because they actually interviewed some of the people that participated in the killing of these men in this one village, including the people who literally dug the graves for them. Well, we're just going to take a moment to remind you that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about Myanmar's ethnic cleansing of its Rohingya minority, and whether those responsible will ever be held to account. We're joined by Maxim Pensky of Binghamton University, the journalist Verena Hölzl, and Azeem Ibrahim of the U.S. Army War College. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. You can find our archives and additional coverage of underreported international news, human rights, and press freedom issues. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, or see our videocast on YouTube. Well, Azeem Ibrahim, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar's state counselor, the most powerful civilian politician, obviously someone who's well known in the West since she won a Nobel Peace Prize for her resistance to Myanmar's military junta. There seem to be a couple different schools of thought about her role in the genocide, ethnic cleansing that's taken place. One that just says that she's sort of culpable in the sense that she didn't use her moral authority to speak out against what happened. There's another view that she's been more active in spreading disinformation and in actively giving cover to the military's genocide, essentially. What's your take on this?
Well, one of the questions I get asked most often, Jason, is that why is this happening now? Why did this happen in 2017 when you are claiming that the Myanmar authorities have been trying to get rid of the Rohingya for over half a century? And if you look at genocides and the history of genocides, it's very common for the perpetrators of a genocide to undertake a dry run, to undertake a test run to see if they can get away with this with the international community and local actors. The Myanmar military undertook a test run in October 2016 when they burnt down a number of villages and expelled tens of thousands of Rohingya into Bangladesh and murdered and raped dozens upon dozens of them. And they learnt three important lessons. One of the most critical lessons that they learnt is that Aung San Suu Kyi defends the military in public. Aung San Suu Kyi became a shield for all criticism against the military in the public domain and in the international media. For example, when the United Nations produced a report saying that ethnic cleansing is happening, she said to BBC's Fergal Keane that ethnic cleansing is far too strong a word to use. Both sides are equally to blame. So drawing a moral equivalence between the two parties, the persecuted and the perpetrators. When the UN also produced a report saying that 52% of Rohingya women had been raped, she said on her Facebook page that this is fake rape. And those comments are still up on her Facebook page. When the UN passed a resolution for a full fact-finding mission, she said this will not be very helpful, and it was her office that refused to give visas to the UN. So I accept she does not control the military directly, but she does control the visas in her country. She is the de facto foreign minister in her country, and she has continuously refused to use her office to even say the word Rohingya, let alone stand up for them.
So it sounds like, in part, she's traded on this enormous credibility that she built up during her years as a political prisoner resisting the military junta to essentially provide cover for the military to carry out these atrocities.
But when I was researching my book, Jason, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. Almost everybody that had known her intimately for many years told me that Aung San Suu Kyi is a Burma Buddhist nationalist. She believes that Burma is a country just for the Buddhists, and these minorities just happen to be there, and they don't actually belong in Burma. Only Buddhists can be loyal citizens of this country. And she herself has said that she is not a humanitarian icon. She is a politician. And she has simply made a political calculation now that the Rohingya issue is simply not worth utilising any of her political capital over.
Well, Max Pensky, if I could turn this to you. We mentioned that the UN released this big report in August saying that what happened is a genocide. Then just last week, the U.S. State Department released its own very extensive report based on more than 1,000 interviews with Rohingya, and it confirms essentially everything that the UN says, but it doesn't call what's happened in Myanmar genocide. Talk to us about that.
It goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is that the term genocide carries with it very concrete legal obligations on the part of states. And the United States, took decades after 1948 to ratify the Genocide Convention. It was a very late adopter of the Genocide Convention. It was sort of late to the show there. And still to this day, I think the State Department, especially in its current manifestation, is extremely reluctant to undertake any substantive international legal obligations around genocide. And so I think that it's not terribly surprising that the State Department looks at all the same facts that the UN does, interviews the same people that the UN does, but then is much more reluctant than the UN to actually describe the situation as a genocide, which it clearly is.
Well, Verena Hölzl, if I could turn this to you. You've spent some time in the major Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, just over the border from Myanmar. Tell us, if you would, about the living conditions there. I understand you also witnessed a program that sought to reunite families in refugee camps that have been separated by the violence.
Yes, I've been there a couple of times over the past year, and as you can imagine, it has developed a lot. So what was like anarchy in the beginning has developed into a sort of, I mean, you can even call this a sort of city. It's over 1 million people, and obviously they have restarted their lives. So you have shops in there, people are trying to work, to make money. They have built their shelters. So, yeah, you can say in a way that they try as much as they can to go on with their lives, because, yeah, I mean, what other possibility do they have, right? So this is happening. To maybe share something more uplifting than like all the misery and the fact that these people are still stateless. They are not only refugees, they are also stateless. So that makes the whole problem even more complicated to find a better future for them. Yeah, to share something more positive, what I have seen over time is that there's also some sort of civil society evolving. So you have Rohingya who start to speak up for their community. They are not, they don't depend anymore on those people who have supported them for so long, like Ne, who we spoke to earlier. And I would say that's a positive thing, and that's something they were not able to do in Rakhine State because of all the oppression. And what you were referring to, I did a story in July about the reunification of families. So you have to see that this crackdown caused so much chaos, obviously, that many families got separated. People ended up in prison. People got killed. They lost each other in the mayhem. And there were both Rohingya people who tried to reunite them, like with the simplest means, like just a loudspeaker that they used. And besides these people, obviously the NGOs did.
So there was. It sounds like there was a happy ending for some people then in these camps. But I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm sorry. Yeah. We're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA, Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Ro Nay San Lwin, Maxim Pensky, Verena Hölzl, and Azeem Ibrahim. Our assistant producers this week are Chris Croonan, Tatum Pugh, and Melody Zhao. Yanqi Xu is our supervising producer. Maggie Duncan is visual editor. Aaron Hay is audio engineer. Travis McMillan is director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in. And I'm sorry I had to cut you off at the end, Verena. We were just out of time.